Today's story is so gripping, it turns silence into its own kind of battlefield, unfolding beneath an unforgiving sky and a land soaked in memory. This is where loss meets honor, and survival demands more than solitude. It begins with a single moment of compassion, quiet, risky, and powerful enough to change everything at Ashen Vows. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Out on the harsh sweep of the Texas Panhandle, beneath a sky stretched wide and pitiless, a lone woman moved like a shadow, barely claimed by the land itself. For 5 long years, Evangeline Hayes had spoken to nothing living, only to the memory of her husband and the restless wind that carried away the names of the dead. She had faded into solitude, a forgotten figure on a plain that swallowed people without remorse. Then, on a bitter afternoon, as an unnatural blizzard tore south across the territory, her isolation was broken. Not by a stray traveler or neighbor checking in, but by 9 Comanche warriors, silent and imposing, their war paint stark against the white glare, their eyes reflecting the cold fury of the storm closing in. They did not raise weapons. They asked for shelter. The silence of the Llano Estacado pressed down like a weight, settling over the sod roof of Evangeline Hayes' cabin, seeping through the chinked logs and into her bones. For 5 years, that silence had been her only companion. It was broken only by the cry of a hawk overhead, the sudden dart of a jackrabbit through sage, or the quiet sound of her own voice as she tended the 2 wooden crosses on the rise behind her home. Bartholomew Hayes, beloved husband. Samuel Hayes, our dearest son. The wind had worn the names thin, just as time had dulled the sharp edge of her grief into something constant and aching. Bart had died beneath a rock slide, chasing silver in the territories. A year later, little Samuel, only 4, had been taken by fever, his small body giving out in the same bed where Evangeline now slept alone. After that, the world had narrowed. A single-room cabin, a mule, endless prairie stretching to every horizon. She was 42, though the sun and wind had etched years into her face. Fine lines framed her eyes and mouth, and her hands, strong, scarred, and calloused, told the story of labor meant for 2 men, not 1 woman. Lean and sinewy, she moved with quiet efficiency. She could track deer, dress a carcass in the field, and handle the heavy Winchester resting against the wall as naturally as breathing. She had learned because she had no choice. The nearest town, Redemption Creek, lay 2 days away by horse. She rode there only twice a year, for salt, flour, and coffee. The townsfolk watched her with wary eyes, pity tangled with suspicion. A woman alone was both vulnerable and unsettling. They called her the Llano Ghost. Evangeline didn't mind. Ghosts were usually left alone. That afternoon, a sickly green hue crept beneath the bruised purple clouds, gathering in the north. The air turned heavy, unnaturally still, carrying a cold that didn't belong to October. Evangeline paused at the water pump and sniffed the wind. She knew this sign. A blue norther, she muttered. A sudden, violent drop in temperature, often dragging a blizzard behind it. She moved at once, stacking firewood against the cabin wall, hitching her skirts as she worked. She checked the door bar, secured the single window, and filled the feed trough for Daisy, her mule. Each motion was practiced, survival refined into ritual. When the first wet flakes fell, thick and fast, the world beyond her window vanished into a spinning wall of white. The temperature plunged, The wind rose from a mournful moan to a shriek that rattled the cabin's bones. Inside, Evangeline lit the kerosene lamp, its amber glow pushing back against the dark, pressing in from all sides. For the moment, she was ready. She did not yet know how completely that storm would change her life. She set a pot of venison stew on the cast-iron stove, the savory scent offering a thin layer of comfort against the violence of the storm outside. Everything she needed was within reach. She could outlast this weather. She was safe, or so she told herself. Near dusk, Daisy screamed from the lean-to, a sharp, panicked bray that sliced through the wind. It wasn't the warning cry of a coyote or the hiss of a panther. This sound carried a heavier, deeper terror. Evangeline's hand froze above the ladle. She reached for the Winchester, its cool weight settling into her palms like something familiar and steady. Moving without a sound, she crossed to the door and peered through the narrow peephole she'd bored into the thick planks. At first, there was only snow, whirling, blinding, endless. Then shapes took form within the white chaos. Horses, not iron-shod mounts, but lean Indian ponies, heads lowered against the wind. Then the riders emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered men wrapped in heavy buffalo robes, snow crusted into their long black hair and the feathers tied within it. Even through the storm, she caught the dull shine of rifle barrels, and the stark war paint streaked across their faces, black and red, bold against pale skin. Comanche. A war party, caught in the open. 9 of them. Her heart slammed against her ribs, wild and frantic. This was the fear she had buried for years. Not hunger, not loneliness, but this. The men who had ruled this land, long before any white settler dared cross the Red River. They sat motionless in the blizzard, a row of dark spirits on horseback, eyes locked on her cabin, the only shelter for miles. They did not charge. They waited. A cold unrelated to the storm crept into Evangeline's veins. They knew she was inside. The lamp glowed in the window. Smoke lifted from the chimney. There was no hiding that truth. She could stay silent, pretend the cabin stood empty, but they would know. And a lie only sharpened danger. Refuse them, and they might burn her out. Open the door, and she would stand alone. One woman facing 9 warriors in a space no larger than a stall. Her life would rest entirely in their hands. Her gaze drifted to the mantel, to the small wooden bird Samuel Hayes had carved. She remembered Bart, his steady hands, his quiet voice. "Courage ain't about not being scared, Evie," he used to say. "It's about doing what's right anyway." What was right? The leader dismounted, a massive man with a face carved like weathered stone. He moved toward the cabin with deliberate steps, boots sinking deep into the snow. He did not reach for a weapon. 10 feet from the door, he stopped and lifted one hand, palm open, the universal sign of peace. War paint still marked his face, making the gesture all the more striking. Drawing a long, unsteady breath, Evangeline leaned the Winchester against the wall beside the door, close enough to seize in a heartbeat. Her fingers went white as she slid the heavy bar free. She pulled the door open just a crack, the wind howling, fighting to tear it wide. Cold slammed into her like a blow. The Comanche leader stood before her, dark eyes meeting hers without flinching. They were sharp and intelligent. Absent of immediate threat, weighing only the storm, the cabin, and the woman standing in the doorway. His voice came low and steady, spoken in his own language, the sound more felt than heard. Even without the words, his meaning carried through. He motioned first to the white fury of the blizzard, then to her cabin, and finally back toward the men behind him. It was not a demand. It was a request for shelter. Evangeline's throat tightened. She looked past him at the other 8 warriors, their forms half lost in the swirling snow. They were huge men, built hard and powerful, as if shaped directly from the land itself. They were the living embodiment of the wild country she called home. To let them inside was to invite that wilderness across her threshold. Yet she saw the horses shuddering in the wind, the way the men drew their robes closer, and the simple truth that no matter a man's name, race, or reputation, he was small when set against nature's rage. To refuse them now would be a death sentence. She lifted her eyes back to the leader. In his gaze, she did not see a savage, only a man carrying the weight of 8 lives, gambling everything on a single decision. In that moment, she was no ghost, no widow marked by grief. She was simply one human being facing another. With a slow, deliberate nod, Evangeline Hayes pulled the door wide open. The 9 warriors entered in silence, carrying the knife-edge cold with them, along with the smell of wet leather, horse, and snow. The cabin seemed to shrink around them. Their size and presence pressed inward until Evangeline felt like a mouse surrounded by giants. Yet they moved with unexpected control, moccasined feet soundless on the wooden floor. The leader, whom she would later know as Tavakwa, gave a short, guttural command. At once, his men shrugged off their snow-heavy buffalo robes, revealing broad chests and corded arms marked with beadwork and old battle scars. Rifles and bows were stacked neatly against the wall, an unmistakable gesture of trust that did nothing to slow Evangeline's racing heart. She remained near the stove, fingers close to the iron skillet, eyes never resting long on any one face. Each man carried a different expression. Tavakwa stood unmoving, authority etched into every line of his face. A few of the younger warriors glanced about with open curiosity, studying the strange pieces of her world, the ticking clock on the mantel, the worn stack of books, the faded photograph of her and Bart on their wedding day. One man, however, watched her differently. He was younger than Tavakwa, but older than the rest, lean and sharp-featured, with eyes burning with open distrust. His name was Pahayoko. He studied Evangeline not as a host, but as a threat. Every movement she made, every breath she took, drew his attention. He was danger-coiled and waiting, and she knew, deep in her bones, that the real peril in the room did not come from the storm. And then there was another. He stood toward the back, partly in shadow. Not as broad as the others, but tall and spare, his presence quieter. His face held calm rather than suspicion, his expression thoughtful. While the rest measured the room, he seemed to measure her. His eyes noted the way she held her shoulders, the frayed spot on her sleeve where she wiped her hands, the faint tremor she could not fully hide. His name was Nokona. Between them lay a gulf of language, wide and unbridgeable. Tavakwa gestured toward the pot, simmering on the stove, then toward his men. A simple, clear question. Evangeline nodded, unable to find her voice. She filled the 9 tin bowls she owned, some hers, some left behind from Bart's mining days, ladling out the thick venison stew. Her hands shook as she passed the bowls. She half expected them to eat like starving animals. Instead, they sat and ate with quiet restraint, methodical and composed. No one spoke. Their manners were measured, almost formal, more refined than anything she remembered from crowded dining rooms back east. And in the hush of that small cabin, something fragile began to change. When they finished eating, each man returned his bowl with a brief, respectful nod. One of them stepped forward and offered her a strip of dried buffalo meat in return. It was dark, tough, and heavy with smoke. Evangeline accepted it with a small nod of her own, forcing herself to chew and swallow. It was an exchange. Nothing spoken, yet a bargain quietly sealed inside her kitchen. As night settled in, the storm outside surged again, wind clawing at the walls. The men spread out across the floor, pulling their robes tight around themselves. They slept as if the ground itself welcomed them, bodies folding easily into rest. Proof of lives spent moving, never lingering long in one place. Tavakwa positioned himself against the wall facing the door, awake and unmoving, a silent guard. Pahayoko, restless and sharp-eyed, settled near the stacked weapons, one hand curled around the hilt of his knife. His stare fixed on Evangeline without blinking. She knew sleep would not come for her. Evangeline sat in the rocking chair near the stove, as its warmth slowly faded, the Winchester resting across her lap. The hours crept by, measured only by the groan of timber and the long rising howl of the wind. Again and again, her eyes drifted toward Nokoni. He was not asleep. From a small pouch, he drew a piece of tanned deer hide and a stub of charcoal. By the wavering lamplight, he began to draw. His focus was complete, his hand steady and sure, moving with an ease that felt practiced, almost intimate. He did not sketch the storm, nor horses, nor buffalo. Instead, he captured the cabin itself, the stove, the rocking chair, the small wooden bird on the mantel. When their eyes met across the dim room, he did not flinch or try to conceal his work. He simply held her gaze. In his expression there was no threat, only a deep, searching curiosity. It unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. It felt closer, more personal than Pahayoko's open hostility. The first night passed without violence. The blizzard did not. Morning arrived wrapped in a dull, pearly gray. Snow lay packed high against the window, and the wind showed no sign of easing. They were trapped, every one of them. By the second day, a strange rhythm took hold. Evangeline cooked. They shared what little they had. The silence remained, but its edge dulled. It was no longer tight with fear. It became shared confinement. The men spoke quietly among themselves, voices low and restrained. Evangeline kept her hands busy, repairing a torn sack. The simple, repetitive pull of needle through cloth calming her nerves. By afternoon, trouble found them. One of the younger warriors, no more than 18, let out a low cry and slumped forward. A deep cut marked his forearm, wrapped crudely in a strip of hide. The wound was old, likely taken in a skirmish before the storm. Now, in the cold, damp air, it had turned angry. The flesh around it was swollen and red, hot beneath the skin. A dark line crept upward along his arm. Tavakwa and the others gathered close, their faces hard and grim. They knew what they were seeing. Blood poisoning. Out here, it meant death. Pahayoko shot Evangeline a look filled with raw venom, as if her presence, or her cabin, had somehow invited the sickness into the boy's blood. Evangeline hesitated only a heartbeat. She had seen this before. She set her sewing aside and rose, stepping toward them with quiet resolve. Tavakwa shifted his body, cutting off her path, a low warning rumbling in his chest. Evangeline did not retreat. She met his stare head-on and pointed to the boy's arm. Then she pointed to her medicine chest, a small wooden box packed with dried herbs, salves, and clean linen. She lifted both hands, palms open to show she carried nothing. "Let me." The word scraped out of her throat. Tavakwa held her gaze, torn between instinct and necessity. Trusting a white woman ran against everything he knew. But doing nothing meant watching one of his own die. He looked at the boy's ashen, sweat-slick face, then back to Evangeline's. Steady, unflinching. There was no trick in her eyes, only hard-earned competence. With a short, clipped nod, he stepped aside. Pahayoko surged forward, barking a sharp word in Comanche, but Tavakwa cut him off with a single command. The authority in his voice ended the argument. Evangeline knelt. She unwound the filthy binding, her touch unexpectedly gentle. The wound beneath was deep and angry, the flesh swollen and wet. The stench was sharp. She did not hesitate. She set water to boil, dropping in a pungent handful of yarrow and golden seal from her kit. When the infusion was ready, she cleansed the gash with a steaming liquid. The boy hissed, pain breaking through his control, but two of his companions held him steady. She crushed echinacea root into a thick poultice and spread it over the infected flesh, then wrapped the arm tight with clean linen. All the while, she felt Nokona's eyes on her. He had moved closer, not with suspicion like the others, but with the intent focus of someone learning. He watched how she handled each tool, the surety in her hands, the way she murmured soft, calming English to the boy, though he could not understand the words. When she finished, she rose slowly, her back aching. She met Tavakwa's eyes. "He needs to stay warm," she said, shaping the meaning with her hands. "And drink plenty of water." Tavakwa stared at the clean white bandage, then at Evangeline. For the first time, something shifted across his face. Brief, unmistakable respect. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The change rippled through the cabin. The tight edge of fear eased, replaced by a fragile, cautious trust. Later that evening, as Evangeline checked the poultice, Nokona approached and held out the piece of deer hide. He had finished his drawing. It was the mantle, and upon it, the small carved bird. Every line was exact. He pointed to the bird, then looked at her, questioning. A lump rose in Evangeline's throat. She picked up the little wooden figure, its surface polished smooth by years of touch. Without thinking, she walked to the door and pointed into the blizzard toward the rise where the crosses stood, now buried beneath snow. She touched her chest, then lifted 4 fingers, the age Samuel Hayes had been. She met Nokona's gaze and let the grief show. He understood. His expression softened with a comprehension beyond words. He knew what the silence in that cabin was made of. It was shaped by loss. Nokona's eyes moved from her face to the drawing. Then, with a careful, hesitant finger, he pointed toward her. Beside the figure of the sorrowing woman, he drew a single firm line, strong, unbroken, marking her not as someone defeated, but as one who endured. In that quiet exchange, grief meeting strength, a bond took shape, as sudden and powerful as the blizzard tearing across the plains. The storm kept them trapped for 2 more days. Outside, the world remained a howling white void, but within the cabin, something slowly began to thaw. The invisible boundary between Evangeline and her guests softened. On the 3rd night, the young warrior's fever finally broke, his recovery standing as proof of Evangeline's skill. Relief and gratitude moved through the men like a shared breath. They began to speak to her. not only with gestures now, but with single words, pointing to objects, naming them in their own tongue. Zar for stove, Kutz for buffalo robe, Pia for mother. When one of them spoke that last word, he looked at Evangeline with a gentle smile. She answered in kind, teaching them English words. Fire, water, bread. It became a quiet, patient exchange. A bridge laid down word by word across the gulf between their worlds. Only Pahayoko stood apart. He refused to join in, watching the growing ease between his brothers and the white woman with a hardened, sour expression. To him, it was weakness, a forgetting of the blood spilled between their peoples. More than once, he spoke sharply to Tavakwa, his gestures tight with anger. But Tavakwa ended each argument with calm finality. The decision had already been made. Under this roof, in this place, the law of hospitality held. It had been offered, and it would be honored. The quiet bond between Evangeline and Nokona deepened in the shared silences. He continued to draw, the charcoal seeming like an extension of his thoughts. He sketched her hands kneading dough, her profile lit by firelight, the loose strands of hair slipping free from her bun. He never tried to hide his work. His drawings were his language. What he could not speak, he shaped into lines. One afternoon, he showed her a different sketch. It was not the cabin. It was a herd of horses flowing across the plain like a living river, manes and tails streaming wild in the wind. The energy captured in the charcoal was breathtaking. In that moment, she understood. He was not only a warrior, he was an artist. He saw the world in motion and spirit, and she felt the urge to offer something of her own in return. From a shelf, she retrieved her most treasured possession beside Samuel's carved bird, a thick, leather-bound book of poetry Bart had once given her. She could not read the words aloud to Nokona, but she could show him the shapes they made upon the page. She opened to a poem by Walt Whitman, the paper softened from years of reading. She pointed to the lines, then to her heart. Nokona touched the page with quiet reverence. Then he pointed to his drawing of the horses and to his own chest. They were sharing their inner worlds, using the only languages available to them. That evening, as Evangeline sat mending one of Bart's old shirts, a task done more for memory than need, Nokona sat across from her, watching her hands. The lamplight eased the hard lines of his face, revealing a sensitivity she had not seen before. His fingers were long and elegant, hands capable of wielding a lance or a piece of charcoal with equal grace. He spoke a single word in Comanche, soft and questioning. He gestured to the shirt, then to the empty space beside her. Evangeline's needle paused, mid-stitch. She understood what he was asking. Her gaze drifted to the faded photograph on the wall, Bart's arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun, young and full of foolish, beautiful hope. Slowly, she nodded. Husband. The word felt unfamiliar on her tongue after so many silent years. She pointed to the photograph. Bartholomew. Nokona studied the image for a long moment. When he looked back at her, there was no pity in his eyes, only a deep, shared understanding. He too came from a world shaped by loss, by ghosts and battles and people who never returned. He did not reach for her. Instead, his fingers brushed the sleeve of the shirt she was mending. Gentle, careful. The gesture carried an intimacy beyond touch, an acknowledgement of the love and grief stitched into the cloth itself. Evangeline did not pull away. She met his gaze, and in that instant, The cabin ceased to be a cage of storm and fear. It became a refuge, a place where two solitary souls from different worlds found a fragile, unspoken bond. On the morning of the 5th day, they woke to something unfamiliar. Silence. The wind had fallen away. When Evangeline opened the door, snow spilled inside in a soft rush. The land beyond had been transformed, clean and brilliant, a vast, white plain beneath a sky impossibly blue. The blizzard had passed. The Comanche stirred, purpose returning with the calm. It was time to move on. They gathered weapons and robes with swift, practiced efficiency. A quiet ache settled in Evangeline's chest. The silence she had once clung to now felt hollow, almost unbearable. Tavakwa approached her, his towering frame casting a long shadow. He held out his hand, palm up. Resting there lay a single eagle feather, flawless, its base wrapped in red-dyed leather. It was a gift of the highest honor, a symbol of courage, strength, and wisdom. Tavakwa spoke in his own language, his voice low and solemn. Though she did not know the words, she understood their meaning. Gratitude, respect, equality. She accepted the feather, her fingers brushing his warm skin. "Thank you," she whispered. The men filed out, freeing their horses from the snow packed around the lean-to. They were warriors again, ready to disappear back into the wild. Nokona lingered last. He paused in the doorway, turning to face her as the morning light framed him like something unreal. He extended the rolled deerskin, pressing it carefully into her hands. A gift. Every observation, every unspoken thought, lived in those charcoal lines. He held her gaze, intensity flickering in his dark eyes, and for a breath she thought he might speak. Instead, he lifted his hand and, almost shyly, touched the side of her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, light as a feather, yet powerful enough to stir something she had buried for 5 long years. Then he turned away. He mounted his pony and followed the others, 9 dark figures fading into the blinding white, riding on without looking back. Evangeline remained in the doorway, cold biting at her face, the eagle feather clasped in one hand and the rolled deerskin in the other. She was alone once more. Yet the silence that settled over the cabin had changed. It was no longer empty. It carried memory, the echo of a shared storm, of a connection she had never believed possible. She unrolled the deerskin. On its back was a final drawing, sketched in the pale hours before dawn. It was her likeness. He had not captured the grief in her eyes. He had drawn her strength. For a week, Evangeline lived inside the strange quiet left behind by the storm and her guests. The cabin felt too large, hollow. Silence rang against the walls. She caught herself brewing more coffee than she needed, hands moving from habit, still preparing for 10 instead of 1. She placed the eagle feather on the mantel beside Samuel's carved bird. At night, she unrolled Nokona's drawings by lamplight, tracing the charcoal lines with her fingertip, remembering the steady intensity of his gaze. Something within her had shifted. The hard shell she had built around her heart had cracked. Light had found its way in. She even caught herself humming while she worked, something she hadn't done in years. The land remained dangerous, but it no longer felt entirely empty. As the snow surrendered beneath the relentless Texas sun, the prairie dissolved into a sea of mud and brown grass. It was then that another storm, far darker than the first, set its sights on her home. His name was Augustus Kane. Cain was a cattle baron who had come into the territory 3 years earlier with a massive herd, a small army of hard-eyed cowboys, and the firm belief that the world belonged to any man ruthless enough to seize it. He controlled most of the land east of Redemption Creek. But his empire suffered from one fatal weakness: water. His creeks were fouled by overgrazing, and the deep aquifers beneath his land were failing. Evangeline's homestead, however, was different. Her well was sunk deep, tapping a sweet, steady spring that never ran dry. A narrow creek fed by that same source cut through the western edge of her land. During the dry months, it was the only running water for 30 miles. Augustus Cain wanted it. He had approached her twice before. The first time, he sent a foreman with a cheap offer meant to buy her out quietly. She refused. The second time, Cain came himself. A large, florid man with pale, lifeless eyes and a smile that never reached them. He doubled his offer and followed it with a thinly veiled warning about how unsafe it was for a woman to live alone. Evangeline answered by resting the unblinking barrel of her Winchester between them. He left in fury. Now, he believed the moment had come. The blizzard, he assumed, would have weakened her, drained her supplies, shaken her resolve. He imagined her desperate, worn down, ready to fold. A predator sensing blood. Evangeline spotted them long before they reached her land. A thick column of dust rising against the afternoon sky. This was no handful of riders. It was a heavy, rolling cloud, dozens strong. The fragile calm she had found vanished, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. She secured Daisy in the lean-to, barred the shutter, and took her place by the door, the Winchester fitting easily into the crook of her arm. Augustus Cain rode at the front, flanked by his foreman, Floyd, a wiry man with sharp eyes, and 10 armed riders behind them. They were not dressed for ranch work. They had come for intimidation. They were dressed to frighten. Gun belts hung low on their hips, faces set hard, empty of anything like mercy. They reined in their horses a short distance from the cabin, spreading out into a loose semicircle. The kind of formation meant to make a lone person feel small. Augustus Cain's voice rolled across the prairie, smooth and smug. "We're here to have a final discussion about your property." Evangeline pulled the door open and stepped into the glare of afternoon sun. She did not lift the rifle, but she held it easy at her side, a quiet statement of intent. "There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Cain," she called back, her voice steady despite the tight knot in her gut. "This land is not for sale." Cain laughed, a thick, grating sound. "Then you misunderstand the situation. I'm done asking." He leaned forward in his saddle. "This is your final notice. You'll take my offer of $500 and be gone by sunrise tomorrow. I've got the deed right here, just needs your name." He slapped the leather satchel hanging from his saddle horn. "That paper's a lie," Evangeline said. "This land was deeded to my husband by the state. It's mine now." "The state?" Cain sneered, sweeping his arm across the empty prairie. "The state's a long way from here, Mrs. Hayes. Out here, the only law that matters is strength. And I've got more of it than you ever will." His men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting closer to their pistols. The threat thickened the air. "This is my home," Evangeline said, her voice dropping, edged with cold fury. "And the only thing you'll get from me is a bullet if you step onto it without my permission." Cain's face reddened. Whatever patience he'd had snapped. "You stupid woman. You really think you can stand against me?" He turned sharply. "Floyd, you and a couple of the boys go in there and start packing her things. We'll escort her to town ourselves." Floyd and two others swung down from their saddles, grinning as they started toward the cabin. Evangeline's heart thundered. She might drop one, maybe two, before they cut her down. It was a desperate losing stand. She brought the Winchester up, the stock firm against her cheek, sighting down the barrel as her finger tightened on the trigger. Then another sound broke the moment. Soft, measured, the dull thud of unshod hooves on damp earth. From behind the small rise where Bart and Samuel lay buried, 9 figures appeared. They crested the hill and halted, ponies silhouetted against the sharp blue sky. They wore no war paint. Their faces were bare, their posture calm, and yet their presence struck harder than any painted threat. Tavakwa sat at their head, his expression carved from stone. To his right rode Nokona, his gaze locking instantly onto Evangeline, his jaw tightening as he took in the scene. To Tavakwa's left was Pahayoko, his face lit with a fierce, unmistakable satisfaction. This was an enemy he understood. Kane and his men froze. Smirks vanished. Fear crept in, sharp and sudden. They had come expecting a lone widow. Instead, they faced 9 Comanche warriors, who seemed to have risen straight out of the land itself. Tavakwa urged his pony forward. The others followed, forming a second line, silent, unyielding. A living barrier between Augustus Kane and Evangeline Hayes' home. They did not raise rifles or string bows. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was a threat sharp enough to cut flesh. Augustus Kane stared, his mind scrambling to make sense of what stood before him. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Who are these savages?" Tavakwa did not even look at him. His gaze rested on Evangeline Hayes, and he gave her a slow, nearly invisible nod. It was not a question. It was a declaration. "We stand with you." Evangeline let the muzzle of her rifle dip a fraction. Relief flooded her so suddenly her legs trembled. She was not alone. Beside her, Nokona's eyes burned cold and steady, fixed on Kane. In them was a fury she had never seen, directed not at a rival, but at a threat. He saw the greed in Kane's face, the arrogance, the danger aimed at the woman who had sheltered them, healed one of their own, and shared her grief without words. Pahayoko was the first to speak. He spat a harsh word in Comanche, a curse so raw it needed no translation. Kane found his voice again, sputtering with anger and confusion. "I have no quarrel with you people. This is business between me and this woman. Step aside." Tavakwa ignored him completely. He spoke in Comanche, his tone calm, but carrying absolute authority. At once, Nokona and 2 others swung down from their ponies and moved to flank Evangeline. Rifles came into their hands, not raised, not rushed, held with an easy readiness far more terrifying than open threat. Everything changed. Kane and his 12 hired guns were no longer the force in control. They were trespassers, facing a united wall on land that rejected them. His men were bullies and ranch hands, not warriors seasoned against Comanche steel. Fear rippled through their line. Eyes darted. Confidence drained away. Kane's face flushed purple with rage and humiliation. And in that moment, he made the last mistake of his life. "To hell with this," he roared, jerking his pistol free. "This land is mine. Fire!" He did not aim at the warriors. He aimed at Evangeline. The world shattered. Before his arm fully straightened, before his order could even register with his panicking men, an arrow appeared from nowhere. It tore through the air with a sound like ripping cloth and struck his gun hand. The revolver dropped as Kane screamed, a thin, broken cry of pain. The arrow, fletched with a hawk's feather, had driven clean through his wrist, pinning his hand to the saddle horn. Every warrior moved as one. There was no chaos, no wasted motion, not 12 men acting separately, but a single force forged by years of combat. Pahayoko loosed a savage cry of triumph as he set another arrow. Tavakwa's rifle was already braced at his shoulder. Beside Evangeline, Nokona shoved her back toward the cabin with one arm while raising his Winchester with the other. "Inside," he shouted, the English word sharp and urgent. Kane's men broke. They had come expecting fear, not war. Some, including Floyd, managed to draw and fire wildly. Bullets tore into dirt and whined harmlessly past the warriors' heads. But it was already over. Their fear was answered with ruthless accuracy. A rifle cracked from Tavakwa's position, sharp and final, and one of Kane's men slid from his saddle, a small dark bloom spreading across his chest. Almost at the same instant, a shot rang out from a warrior riding hard along the flank. The bullet tore into Floyd's shoulder, spinning him sideways and dumping him face first into the mud, pressed back against the cabin wall. Evangeline Hayes watched in stunned disbelief. This was nothing like the clumsy violence she had once seen in saloons. This was something colder, faster. Violence honed into discipline. The Comanche moved as one with their horses, firing, reloading, and shifting positions in a smooth, flowing rhythm that Kane's panicked men could not follow. Pahayoko became a force unleashed. He loosed arrow after arrow, each shot finding flesh. One struck a cowboy deep in the thigh. Another punched into the neck of a horse, sending the animal crashing down in a screaming heap, trapping its rider beneath it. Pahayoko was not merely fighting, he was exulting. Evangeline's shock burned away, replaced by a clear, steady resolve. This was her land. These were the men standing for her. She would not cower. She lifted her Winchester and found a target, a cowboy lining up a shot at Nokona from behind a frantic horse. She exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the man's hat flew off as he cried out and dove for cover. Nokona glanced at her, surprise flickering into fierce approval, before turning back to the fight. He did not fight like Pahayoko. He was precise, calculated. He fired once, dropping a man with a shattered leg, then used the moment of chaos to shift ground. He was shielding Evangeline, but he was also shaping the field itself. The entire clash lasted less than a minute. It was not a battle. It was judgment. Confronted with a force they could neither intimidate nor understand, the remaining riders broke. Horses wheeled, spurs bit, and Kane's men fled east in wild disorder, shame riding hard on their heels. Silence fell again, thick with gun smoke and pain. 4 of Kane's men lay scattered, some unmoving, others writhing. The man Evangeline had fired at scrambled away on foot. Floyd clutched his ruined shoulder, his face drained of color, and Augustus Kane sat frozen in his saddle, whimpering, his hand still pinned to the horn by the arrow, terror hollowing his eyes. Tavakwa rode forward at a measured pace until he stood before the cattle baron. He studied the arrow, then Kane's tear-streaked face. Reaching out, he snapped the shaft with a single brutal twist, leaving the barbed head buried in wood and flesh. Kane screamed. Tavakwa spoke then, his voice low, cold as winter water. He spoke in English, slow and deliberate, words learned and saved for moments like this. "This land," he said, indicating the cabin with his rifle. The well, the graves on the hill, they are under the protection of the Numunu, the people. He turned his gaze back to Cain. The woman who lives here is Piatukbi-Pue, a friend of honor. His voice did not rise. You will not return. You will tell your people what happened here, Tavakwa said, his voice flat and unforgiving. If you, or any man like you, return to this place, we will not leave you alive to carry the warning. His gaze shifted to the wounded sprawled in the dirt. He barked a sharp command in Comanche. 2 warriors dismounted at once, stripping rifles from the fallen and dragging the injured men onto their horses without ceremony. The remaining mounts were rounded up, including Augustus Cain's. You will walk back, Tavakwa told Cain, and you will remember. Then he turned away. The war party gathered the spoils, guns and horses, driving the wounded men's mounts ahead of them. Cain slid from his saddle, clutching his bleeding wrist, and staggered off in the direction his men had fled, a broken, humiliated figure shrinking into the distance. The Comanche turned back toward the cabin. The fight was finished. The violence had passed. Evangeline Hayes stood where she was, the Winchester still in her hands, knuckles white. Nokona approached her, stopping a few feet away. His chest rose and fell, breath still sharp from the clash. His eyes searched her face, her arms, her stance. You are not hurt? He asked, his English careful, deliberate, like Tavakwa's. No, she whispered. I'm not hurt. Because of you. He nodded, the tension easing from his shoulders. His gaze dropped to the rifle in her hands, then lifted again to her eyes. You fight, he said. It was not a question. I had to, she answered. Pahayoko rode past then, a bloodied scalp hanging from his belt, taken from one of the dead. His grin was fierce, unrepentant. He met Evangeline's eyes and lifted his hand in a sharp salute before wheeling his horse away, loosing a victorious cry. In the crucible of combat, she had proven herself. She was not a fragile white woman. She was someone who stood her ground. In Pahayoko's eyes, she had earned her place on this land. Tavakwa gave Evangeline a final nod. The debt of hospitality had been repaid, in blood and in protection. His duty was complete. At his quiet command, the warriors began to move out, driving their newly claimed horses before them. They were leaving, this time for good. They rode away not into a world of white, but into the warm, burnished light of the setting sun. Their dark figures crossed the prairie, growing smaller, thinning into silhouettes, until they became nothing more than marks against the vast horizon, melding back into the land that had formed them. Nokona rode last. Just before they vanished over a gentle rise, he stopped. He turned in his saddle, a solitary figure framed by fire-colored sky. Though she could not see his face, Evangeline felt his gaze reach her across the distance. He raised one hand, not a wave, but a slow, solemn farewell. Then he turned and was gone. Evangeline stood there until the last trace disappeared, until the dust settled and the prairie reclaimed its breath. Only the low cry of the wind remained, and the faint groans of the 2 men Tavakwa had left behind. Dead men, a stark reminder of what the day had cost. Exhaustion finally claimed her, heavy as a physical burden. She looked at her cabin, at the torn earth, the hoof-churned ground, the dark stains in the dust. Her solitude had been violated twice, first by storm, then by violence. But she was still standing, and her home was still hers. She did not hesitate before the work that remained. With grim determination, Evangeline took up a shovel and began to dig. She would not leave the bodies to the coyotes. Whatever their crimes, they had been men. They deserved the dignity of earth. She worked through the fading light and into full darkness, the steady scrape of metal against soil marking time. The labor was brutal, her muscles burning, her hands blistering. But with each shovelful, something inside her eased. It felt like a cleansing. She was burying the last trace of the threat, reclaiming her land with sweat and will. When the work was done, she stood in silence, between the two fresh, unmarked graves and the two familiar wooden crosses on the rise beyond. 5 years earlier, she had laid her hope in this ground. Today, she had laid her fear beside it. Back inside the cabin, the eagle feather and Nokona's rolled deerskin drawings rested on the small table. They felt like relics from another life. She was no longer only Evangeline Hayes, the widow. She was the woman who had sheltered a Comanche war party, the woman who had stood against Augustus Kane, the woman who had fought. The name the Comanche had given her echoed quietly in her mind. Paya tu Bipue, a friend of honor. Days turned into weeks. Word of what happened at the Hayes homestead spread like fire. Kane's broken, humiliated men carried the story, and with every retelling, it grew. Augustus Kane, his hand ruined and his authority shattered, sold off what remained of his holdings and vanished from the territory. No one troubled Evangeline again. The tale of the Llano ghost faded, replaced by another, of the woman protected by the Comanche. Travelers gave her land a wide berth, not from fear alone, but from respect. Life settled into routine once more, but this solitude was different. It was not hollow. It carried echoes of voices, of firelight, of shared danger and trust. She found herself watching the horizon with something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not dread, hope. Often, she would touch the eagle feather or unroll the deer skin, tracing the charcoal lines of her own face, the one where he had drawn her strength. Then, one evening, months later, as spring breathed green back into the prairie, she saw a rider coming. Her hand went to the Winchester by instinct, but her heart stayed calm. There was something unmistakable in the way the rider sat his pony, a quiet balance she recognized at once. It was Nokona. He rode alone. No war paint, no travel gear, only simple buckskins. He stopped at a respectful distance and dismounted. Evangeline stepped out to meet him, her stride steady, her heartbeat strong and hopeful. He carried no drawings this time. He simply stood before her, the lowering sun catching the deep, calm darkness of his eyes. He had learned more English. She could hear it in the certainty of his voice, the care in his words. Evangeline Hayes, he said, her name sounding natural on his tongue. Nokona, she answered, a small smile touching her lips, the first in longer than she could remember. I came back, he said simply, as if no other outcome had ever been possible. I see that, she replied softly. His gaze moved over the cabin, the land stretching wide around them, then returned to her. This is a lonely place for one person. It has been, she said honestly. But it's my home. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. A home needs more than one voice, he said quietly. So the silence does not win. From the pouch at his belt, Nokona drew out a small object and placed it in his palm. It was a bird, carved from the pale wood of a cottonwood root. The workmanship was careful and precise, the wings slightly lifted, as if the creature were caught in the moment before flight. It was a pair, a companion to the bird Samuel had carved years ago. He offered it to her without ceremony. Evangeline looked at the bird, then lifted her eyes to his. There was no grand vow there, no promises stretching farther than the land itself. What she saw was quieter than that. An offering, a beginning. Another voice willing to stand against the silence with her. She reached out and took the bird. For a brief instant, her fingers closed around his. His hand was warm, steady, real. In that small touch, something new took root. Not a story of a white woman and a Comanche warrior, but of two survivors. Two souls who had endured loss and found, against all reason, a shared refuge in the heart of an unforgiving land. The future lay open before them, unwritten and uncertain. Yet for the first time in many years, Evangeline Hayes felt no fear in facing it. In the Wild West, stories were not only told, they were etched into the earth by hardship, by honor, and by bonds forged where none should have existed. Her story with Nokona lived there now, carved into wind and soil. It spoke of a truth older than borders or bloodlines, that strength is not the absence of loneliness or fear, but the courage to meet them with an open heart. And that true shelter is not merely walls and a roof, but the willingness to recognize the human soul behind a stranger's eyes. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso legal. Disclaimer: our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully, only to support production, while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.